My daughter-in-law laughed at my dress before the waiter even finished pouring the wine. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a soft, amused little sound that carried perfectly across the polished marble table. "Oh my God," Lauren said, covering her mouth like she was trying to be polite. "Frances, that dress looks like it came out of a thrift store from the 90s. Her parents chuckled. A couple at the next table glanced over, and my son Michael just stared at his glass of water. I felt every eye on me. The old navy dress, the worn leather purse resting on my lap, the quiet widow who clearly didn't belong in a five-star restaurant in downtown Atlanta. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I smiled. Slowly, calmly. I placed my purse on the table, and I opened it. Because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the contents of that little old purse were about to change the entire conversation, maybe even their lives. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where the people who were supposed to respect you suddenly made you feel small? If you've ever experienced that kind of moment, tell me in the comments. I read them all, and I'd really like to hear your story. And if you're watching this tonight, let me know where you're from and what time it is where you are. It amazes me how far these stories travel. If stories about family truth and the quiet strength people often underestimate resonate with, you take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now let me take you back 3 weeks before that dinner. Because the truth is that laugh didn't start the story. It only revealed it. 3 weeks before that dinner in Atlanta, my life looked very different from what the Whitmores imagined. Quiet, predictable, small. At least that's how most people saw it. I lived alone in a modest brick house in Charleston, South Carolina. The house sat on a quiet street lined with magnolia trees that had probably been there longer than I had. The paint on my front porch railing had started to peel a little, and the mailbox leaned slightly to one side, but I loved that place. My husband Robert and I had bought it nearly 40 years ago when we were young and believed hard work could solve almost anything. In many ways it did. Robert had been a practical man. He believed in fixing things instead of replacing them. Broken cabinet hinge, he repaired it. Leaky faucet. He stayed up half the night until the drip stopped. Even our kitchen table had been something he built himself in our garage when Michael was 8 years old. That table was still there, and every morning I sat at it with a cup of coffee and the same routine I'd followed since Robert passed away 9 years earlier. I woke early. Old habits from years of working long shifts never quite leave you. Around 6 in the morning, sunlight would start slipping through the lace curtains above the sink, filling the kitchen with a warm, golden light. I would make coffee, feed the stray gray cat that had adopted my porch. Then I would sit down with a notebook and review my schedule for the day. Most people would probably call my life simple, and they wouldn't be wrong. Some mornings, I worked in my small sewing room, the one Robert had helped me build out of what used to be our guest bedroom. The walls were lined with neatly organized shelves, full of thread spools, fabric rolls, measuring tapes, and patterns I had collected over decades. Sewing had been my first job. Back when Michael was a baby, money had been tight. Robert worked long hours at the textile warehouse, and I started taking in clothing repairs for neighbors, hemming pants, fixing zippers, adjusting dresses. Over time, the work grew. People started recommending me to friends. Local boutiques sent small projects my way. Eventually, Robert and I decided to open a small workshop together, Allen Textile Workshop. It wasn't glamorous. We didn't have investors or shiny storefronts, just a rented warehouse space, 6 sewing machines, and a handful of employees who worked harder than anyone I've ever met. But that little company fed our family. It paid for Michael's school supplies, his baseball equipment, his college application fees, and eventually, his law school tuition. Michael had always been smart, sharp-minded, curious, quick to debate anything from history to politics, even when he was just 12 years old. Teachers used to tell me he would go far someday, that he had the kind of brain that belonged in big rooms with powerful people. I believed them. Robert believed them too, and we made sure Michael had every opportunity we never did. There were years when Robert and I barely bought anything for ourselves. I remember one Christmas when our washing machine broke 2 weeks before tuition payments were due. Robert and I stood in the laundry room looking at it like it was some kind of puzzle. We couldn't afford both. So we kept the broken machine. For 3 months I washed our clothes by hand in the bathtub. Michael never knew that part. Parents rarely tell their children those stories. We want them to see stability, not sacrifice. Michael did well in college, then even better in law school. By the time he graduated, he already had an offer from a prestigious firm in Atlanta. I still remember the day of his graduation. I wore the navy blue dress Lauren had laughed at that night. At the time, it wasn't an old dress. It was the nicest thing I owned. I sat in a huge auditorium surrounded by families far wealthier than ours, people in designer suits, luxury watches, and polished shoes. I remember feeling a little out of place back then, too. But when Michael walked across that stage and accepted his degree, none of that mattered. I clapped until my hands hurt. Robert squeezed my hand and whispered, "We did it." Not long after that, Michael moved to Atlanta. At first, he called every Sunday. He told me about his cases, his coworkers, the fast pace of city life. I listened to every word like it was a story from another world. Then the calls became shorter, every other Sunday. Then once a month. Life gets busy, I told myself. Young professionals work long hours. I never complained. Then Michael met Lauren Whitmore. The Whitmore family was different from us. Very different. Lauren's father, Charles Whitmore, owned a real estate development company with projects across several states. Her mother, Victoria, had been involved in charity boards, art foundations, and social events that appeared regularly in Atlanta magazines. They were the kind of family that appeared in photographs beside politicians and donors. Michael seemed happy when he first told me about Lauren. "She's incredible, Mom," he said during one of our phone calls. "Brilliant, ambitious. Her family's well-connected." I could hear pride in his voice. I was happy for him, truly. The first time I met Lauren was at their engagement dinner 2 years later. She was beautiful, confident, impeccably dressed, the kind of woman who looked like she belonged in every room she walked into. But from the beginning, there was a distance between us. Lauren was always polite, just a little too polite, the way someone speaks when they're trying not to sound rude. After the wedding, Michael visited less often. Most holidays were spent with Lauren's family in Atlanta. I told myself that was normal, too. Children grow up. They build their own lives. Still, there were moments when I felt the quiet space widening between us, which is why 3 weeks before that dinner, Michael's phone call surprised me. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished hemming a pair of linen trousers for a boutique client when my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded cheerful, almost eager. "We should get together soon," he said. "Lauren and I want to talk to you about something important." "Of course," I said. "Is everything all right?" "Oh yeah," he replied quickly. "It's actually good news. A business opportunity." Business opportunity. That phrase caught my attention. Michael continued. "There's a development project we're involved in, and it might make sense for the family to participate. Nothing complicated. Just a few documents we'd need you to sign." "Sign." I leaned back in my chair slowly. "What kind of documents?" I asked. "Just standard paperwork," he said. "Lauren's dad has lawyers handling everything." There was a small pause. Then Michael added something that stayed with me. "It could be really good for all of us, Mom." I looked around my quiet kitchen. The sunlight had shifted across the floor. The gray cat outside my window flicked its tail lazily. Something about the conversation felt unusual. Michael had never asked me to sign anything before. Still, I kept my voice calm. "When would you like to meet? How about dinner in Atlanta next Friday?" he said. "Lauren's parents want to join us too." That surprised me even more. But I agreed. "All right," I said. "Great," Michael replied. "You'll love the restaurant." When we hung up, I sat there for a long moment. The house felt unusually quiet. Then I stood up, walked to the window, and watched the magnolia trees sway gently in the afternoon breeze. At the time, I didn't know that dinner would become the moment my entire understanding of my son would begin to change. The morning of the dinner, I woke up earlier than usual. Some habits are difficult to explain. When something important is coming, sleep becomes lighter. My eyes opened around 5:30, long before the sun fully rose over Charleston. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock above the kitchen doorway. For a moment I lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Michael's phone call from 3 weeks earlier. A business opportunity. Sign some documents. Lauren's parents will be there. The words replayed in my mind like a slow, careful puzzle I hadn't finished solving yet. Eventually, I got up and walked into the kitchen, still wearing my robe. The hardwood floor was cool under my feet. I turned on the coffee maker, and soon the familiar smell of fresh coffee filled the room. Routine is comforting. I poured myself a cup and sat at the kitchen table Robert had built all those years ago. My fingers traced the faint scratch marks on the wood, little scars from decades of family life. Michael used to do his homework at that table. He used to argue with me about history assignments and politics and whether pineapple belonged on pizza. He used to laugh a lot back then. I took a slow sip of coffee. Outside the window, the gray porch cat was already waiting, sitting patiently on the railing like a tiny statue. I opened the back door and placed a small bowl of food down for him. He purred in approval. Simple things. Those small morning rituals made the house feel less empty since Robert passed away. After breakfast, I went to the sewing room. The sunlight came through the tall window, illuminating rows of neatly organized fabrics stacked along the wall. I ran my fingers along a shelf of thread spools, each one labeled and sorted by color. Sewing had always helped me think. When life becomes complicated, stitching something together, one thread at a time, makes the world feel more manageable. But that morning, I couldn't focus on the fabric in front of me. My mind kept drifting back to the dinner. Michael had sounded unusually enthusiastic during our call, almost eager. That part had stayed with me. He hadn't spoken that way in a long time. Maybe this dinner was his way of reconnecting, I thought. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Around 10 in the morning, I decided to start getting ready for the trip to Atlanta. It wasn't a terribly long drive, about 5 hours, but I preferred leaving early so I wouldn't feel rushed. I packed a small overnight bag, a spare blouse, a pair of comfortable shoes, and the navy blue dress. That dress hung carefully in the back of my closet. When I pulled it out, the fabric felt soft under my fingers. It wasn't expensive by most standards, but it was well made. I had taken care of it. Good fabric can last a lifetime if you treat it properly. As I laid the dress on my bed, memories came rushing back. Michael's graduation day. The auditorium had been enormous, filled with proud families and flashing cameras. Robert and I had arrived early to find good seats, though we still ended up near the back. I remember smoothing the wrinkles out of that same navy dress in the bathroom mirror before the ceremony began. At the time, it had been the nicest dress I owned. Robert had stood behind me and smiled. "You look perfect," he said. I laughed at him. "I look like a woman who spent too much money on parking," I replied. But when Michael walked across the stage and accepted his law degree, none of those small worries mattered. That moment felt like the reward for every sacrifice Robert and I had ever made. Holding the dress now, years later, I wondered if Michael still remembered that day the same way I did, or if time had softened those memories. I carefully placed the dress into my bag and closed the zipper. By noon, I was ready to leave. The drive from Charleston to Atlanta is one I've done many times. The highway winds through stretches of tall pine trees and small southern towns that seem to exist in their own quiet rhythm. I like driving alone. It gives me time to think. As the miles passed beneath my tires, I thought about Michael, about the little boy who once insisted on wearing superhero pajamas to the grocery store, about the teenager who stayed up all night studying for exams, about the young man who hugged me tightly before leaving for law school and promised he would always make me proud. People don't become strangers overnight. Change happens slowly, sometimes so slowly that you don't notice it until one day you look up and realize the person in front of you feels unfamiliar. By the time I reached the outskirts of Atlanta, the afternoon traffic had begun building. Tall glass buildings reflected the sunlight like mirrors, and the city buzzed with the energy of people moving quickly towards somewhere important. Michael had sent me the name of the restaurant earlier that week. When I saw it, I recognized it immediately. It was one of those places you see in magazines, a luxury restaurant downtown known for hosting politicians, celebrities, and business executives. I parked my car in the nearby garage and checked the time. 6:30. Dinner was scheduled for 7. As I stepped out onto the sidewalk, a warm evening breeze brushed against my face. The city lights were beginning to flicker on, and the streets hummed with quiet sophistication. I smoothed my dress gently before walking toward the restaurant entrance. Inside the lobby was elegant in a way that almost felt theatrical. Marble floors, tall golden light fixtures, soft music floating through the air like a whisper. A hostess greeted me with a polite smile. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," I said. "Allen. The table should be under Michael Allen." She checked her screen quickly. "Of course," she replied. "Your party has already arrived." Already arrived. For a moment, I felt a small flutter of nerves in my chest. The hostess guided me through the dining room. The space was breathtaking high ceilings, enormous windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline, and tables filled with well-dressed guests, speaking quietly over candlelight. Then I saw them. Michael was seated near the center of the room. Lauren sat beside him looking elegant in a cream-colored designer dress. Across from them were her parents, Charles and Victoria Whitmore. They looked exactly as I remembered, confident, comfortable, like people who had spent their lives in places like this. Michael noticed me first. He stood up quickly and gave a brief wave. "Mom," he said as I approached, "you made it." I smiled. Of course I did. Lauren stood as well, though her smile seemed carefully measured. Victoria and Charles nodded politely. As I sat down at the table, a waiter approached with a bottle of wine. The glasses were tall and delicate, the tablecloth crisp and white. Everything about the evening felt polished, almost too polished. Lauren's eyes drifted slowly across my dress, from the shoulders to the waist to the hem, and then she laughed. Lauren's laugh was quiet, but it was sharp. The kind of laugh that wasn't meant to sound cruel, yet somehow managed to be exactly that. She placed her napkin neatly on her lap and tilted her head slightly as she looked at me. "Oh, wow," she said, her voice light and amused. "Frances, that dress is vintage." The word hung in the air. Vintage. Not elegant, not classic. Vintage. Victoria Whitmore glanced over her wine glass and smiled politely the way someone does when they're trying not to laugh openly. Charles Whitmore leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together like a man who had seen many awkward dinners before and wasn't particularly interested in stopping this one. I kept my expression calm, but I noticed everything. Lauren's diamond bracelet catching the candlelight, Michael's shoulders stiffening slightly beside her, the curious glance from a couple at the next table. "Vintage can be charming," Victoria added smoothly. "There's a whole fashion movement around it now." Lauren nodded. "Yes," she said, "although usually people choose vintage intentionally." Another small laugh. Michael cleared his throat. "Lauren," he said quietly, but it wasn't a real protest, just a small attempt to soften the moment. I folded my hands gently on the table. "I've had this dress for a while," I said. "That must be obvious," Lauren replied with a smile. The waiter returned just then, carefully pouring wine into our glasses. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Charles Whitmore leaned forward slightly. "So, Frances," he said in a warm, practiced voice, "Michael tells us you used to run a sewing business." "Used to." The word was subtle, but deliberate. "Yes," I said. "My husband and I built a small textile workshop many years ago." "How quaint," Lauren murmured. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It was more than that," he said. "Mom worked really hard." Lauren gave him a quick glance. "I'm sure she did," she replied. Then she turned back to me. "So do you still sew?" "Sometimes," I said. Victoria smiled politely. "Well, that's a lovely hobby to keep in retirement." "Hobby." I took a slow sip of wine. It was excellent, dry, expensive, and poured with the quiet confidence of a restaurant that knew exactly what kind of people normally sat at these tables. Lauren leaned back slightly in her chair, crossing her legs. "Atlanta must feel very different from Charleston," she said. "We move at a much faster pace here." I noticed I replied. Lauren smiled again, though this time there was something slightly sharper behind it. "Michael has been doing incredibly well lately," she said proudly. "His firm just closed a major corporate deal last month." "I heard," I said. Michael glanced at me. "You did?" "You mentioned it during our call." Lauren tapped her fingers lightly on the table. "That's actually part of the reason we wanted to meet tonight," she said. "Ah." So we had arrived at the real purpose of the dinner. Charles Whitmore straightened his jacket slightly. Yes, he said. We've been working on a development project that could be very promising. Michael nodded. It's a commercial redevelopment near the Charleston Port District, he explained. That caught my attention. Charleston Port District, Lauren continued. There's going to be a massive revitalization project there over the next few years. Art spaces, retail boutique hotels, Victoria added. It's expected to be one of the most profitable redevelopment zones on the East Coast. Michael reached into a leather folder beside his chair. That's why we wanted to talk to you tonight, Mom. He placed a stack of documents gently on the table. The papers were thick, professional, carefully organized. Lauren glanced at them with satisfaction. Just some paperwork, she said. Michael slid the documents toward me. If you sign these, you'll become part of the investment structure. I didn't touch the papers yet. Instead, I looked at Michael. And what exactly would I be investing? Michael hesitated for half a second. It's mostly a formality, he said. You already own the property involved. The property? There it was. Lauren's smile widened slightly. Yes, she said. Your little waterfront parcel. Little. I felt a quiet stillness settle inside my chest. Charles leaned forward again. That land is in a perfect location for our development plans, he explained. With the right corporate structure, we can turn it into a very profitable asset. Victoria nodded approvingly. It would benefit everyone in the family. Lauren tapped the documents again. You'd simply transfer the land into a joint development company, she said. Michael and I would handle all the management, and the legal oversight, Michael added. Lauren looked at me expectantly. It's really quite simple. The waiter returned briefly with a basket of warm bread. No one reached for it. The paper sat between us like a silent challenge. I placed my purse gently on my lap and opened the top clasp. Lauren's eyes flicked toward it for a moment before returning to the documents. Of course, she continued smoothly, these legal documents can be a little complicated if you're not familiar with business contracts. Victoria nodded sympathetically. That's why Michael can walk you through the important parts. Michael leaned closer. Mom, it's honestly straightforward. He turned one of the pages and pointed to a section near the bottom. This part just transfers operational control to the development company. Operational control, Lauren repeated. Charles added standard practice in real estate ventures. Lauren smiled again. You won't have to worry about anything. I finally picked up the top page. The paper felt thick beneath my fingers. Legal language filled the paragraphs, carefully written, precise, dense. Michael watched me. Lauren watched me. Victoria and Charles watched me. The entire table had become very quiet. For several seconds, the only sound was the soft clink of glasses from nearby tables. I adjusted my reading glasses slowly. Then I began reading, line by line, paragraph by paragraph. Lauren exhaled softly. Oh my goodness, she said with a small laugh. You don't have to read every single page. Michael gave her a quick look. It's okay, he said. But I noticed something in his voice, a trace of tension. Lauren leaned toward him and whispered quietly, though not quite quietly enough. Francis probably won't understand most of it anyway. Victoria hid a smile behind her wine glass. I continued reading, the first page, then the second, then the third. And by the time I reached the middle of the document, I understood exactly what they were trying to do. By the time I reached the middle of the document, my hands had grown perfectly still, not because I was confused, but because I understood every word. The language was polished, professional, written by lawyers who knew exactly how to disguise a transfer of control inside paragraphs that sounded harmless. I continued reading slowly. Lauren shifted impatiently in her seat. Francis, she said lightly, those documents are over 30 pages. I noticed I replied without looking up. Victoria gave a polite laugh. Well, dear, legal contracts can be exhausting if you're not used to them. Michael leaned forward. Mom, I can summarize the important parts for you. I turned another page. I'm sure you could. Lauren crossed her arms. You know, she said this project has already been in development for months. Everyone involved is ready to move forward. I finished reading the paragraph in front of me, then another, then another. Inside, I felt the quiet tightening of something familiar. Instinct. Robert used to call it my seamstress instinct. When you spend decades sewing fabric, you develop a sense for tension. One thread pulled in the wrong direction can ruin an entire garment. Contracts are not very different. The stitching just happens to be legal language instead of cotton thread. I reached the end of page 12 and carefully turned the next sheet. There it was, the real clause, buried halfway down the page beneath 3 paragraphs of harmless corporate terminology. The document wasn't asking me to participate in an investment. It was asking me to transfer ownership of my waterfront property into a limited development company controlled by Michael and Lauren. Not temporarily, permanently. Once the transfer happened, the land would no longer legally belong to me. It would belong to the company. And that company, according to the ownership structure listed in the appendix, would be majority controlled by Lauren and Michael. I slowly closed the folder. Lauren leaned forward immediately. So she asked. Pretty straightforward, right? I placed the documents back on the table. I have a few questions, I said. Michael straightened slightly. Of course. I tapped one finger gently against the page. This clause here, I said, the one regarding transfer of title. Lauren waved a hand dismissively. That's standard in development partnerships. I looked at Michael. You want me to transfer the land to your company? Michael hesitated. Technically, yes, but it's just for the project structure. And after that, the company manages the asset. Lauren jumped in quickly. We're talking about millions in redevelopment capital, she said. The structure has to be centralized. Victoria nodded approvingly. It's very common in high-level real estate investments. I folded my hands together calmly. So once the land is transferred, I asked, do I still own it? Michael paused. Well, the company owns it, and the company belongs to you and Lauren. Michael rubbed the back of his neck. It's not exactly that simple. Lauren laughed softly. Oh my God, Francis, she said. You're making this sound dramatic. Charles leaned forward. The development will increase the value of that property tenfold, he explained. You'd receive a share of the profits. A share, I repeated. Lauren nodded, yes, through equity distribution. I turned the page again. And according to this clause, I continued the distribution is controlled by the managing partners. Michael swallowed. That's standard corporate governance. Lauren leaned closer. Michael and I would manage the project. That's all. I looked around the table slowly. 4 pairs of eyes watching me. Waiting. Expecting. Lauren reached for her wine glass. Honestly, she said with a small laugh, this really isn't something you need to overanalyze. These types of contracts are complicated even for people who work in finance, Victoria added kindly. You can trust Michael. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached down and opened my purse again. Lauren glanced at it briefly, then back at me. What are you looking for? She asked. My glasses, I said. She blinked. You're already wearing glasses. These are for distance. I took out a second pair of thin reading glasses and placed them on my nose. Lauren's smile faded just slightly. I reopened the document and flipped back to page 12. Let's read this clause together, I said. Michael shifted in his chair. Mom, section 12. B, I continued calmly. Transfer of underlying property title to Whitmore Development Holdings, LLC. Lauren stiffened. It's standard language, she said quickly. I kept reading. Upon execution of this agreement, ownership rights of the property listed in Appendix A will be permanently transferred to the development entity. Charles frowned slightly. Lauren set her glass down. Francis. I continued reading. The original property holder relinquishes all independent decision-making authority over future development sale or leasing of the asset. Silence. Michael looked pale. I closed the folder again. You didn't mention that part on the phone, I said quietly. Michael leaned forward quickly. Mom, listen, Lauren interrupted. This is exactly why lawyers handle these things, she said sharply. Contracts sound complicated when you read them out of context. Victoria placed a calming hand on her daughter's arm. Lauren. But Lauren's patience was already fading. This is ridiculous, she said. We invited you here to include you in a major opportunity. Charles spoke carefully. Francis, the value of that land is currently underutilized. Our development would turn it into a premium commercial property, and you would control it, I said. Michael exhaled slowly. Yes, because that's how development companies operate. Lauren leaned forward, her voice tightening. You'd still benefit financially after giving up ownership. Michael rubbed his temples. Mom, please don't make this difficult. Difficult. That word settled heavily in my chest. For a moment, none of us spoke. Around us, the restaurant continued humming with quiet conversation and clinking glasses. Lauren finally leaned back in her chair. Look, she said we're offering you a chance to be part of something big. Most people would be grateful. I looked at her calmly, and if I don't sign, Lauren didn't hesitate. Well, she said coolly, then you'd be standing in the way of a very profitable project. Michael closed his eyes briefly. Lauren. But she wasn't finished. That land has been sitting there doing nothing for years, she continued. You're not exactly using it. Charles sighed softly. Lauren, but she had already crossed the line. You're holding onto it like some sentimental souvenir, she said. Meanwhile, it could generate serious capital. I folded my hands over my purse. Inside it, tucked between my wallet and my glasses case, was the envelope I had brought with me. The envelope from Harbor Private Bank. Lauren shook her head slightly. I just don't understand why you'd hesitate, she said. I met her eyes. You really don't, I asked. Lauren shrugged. No. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope. The envelope was simple, plain white, slightly creased from being carried inside my purse for several days. Nothing about it looked important. Lauren barely glanced at it, but Michael did. His eyes followed the movement of my hand as I placed the envelope gently on the table. What's that? He asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I ran my finger along the edge of the paper, smoothing it flat against the tablecloth. Lauren sighed. Francis, if this is about the documents again, it's not, I said calmly. Victoria leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing her earlier polite amusement. Charles watched quietly. Michael's gaze moved between the envelope and my face. Mom, he said softly. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded letter, heavy paper, cream-colored, the kind banks use when they want something to feel official. Lauren rolled her eyes. Is that a bank statement? No, I said. I unfolded the letter slowly. The candlelight reflected off the printed letterhead at the top of the page. Harbor Private Bank. Michael frowned slightly. Lauren leaned over the table to look more closely. What bank is that? She asked. A private trust bank, I said. Charles Whitmore's eyebrows lifted slightly. Now that got his attention. Private trust banks do not usually deal with small accounts. I placed the letter flat on the table so everyone could see it. Lauren glanced at it for half a second. Then her expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. Michael leaned closer. What is this? He asked. It's confirmation of the Allen family trust, I said. The words hung in the air for a moment. Lauren blinked. Trust, she repeated. Victoria tilted her head. You have a trust, yes. Michael looked confused. Mom, since when? Since your father died. Charles Whitmore leaned forward, slowly reading the letter more carefully. The silence around the table deepened. Restaurants like that have a particular kind of quiet. Not the silence of emptiness, but the soft hum of wealth. Low voices, gentle music, the occasional clink of glass. Yet somehow the air at our table felt louder than the rest of the room. Lauren finally spoke again. So what? She said. Her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. A trust doesn't change the development structure. I nodded slightly. You're right, I said. Then I tapped a specific paragraph in the letter. But this part might. Michael leaned in closer. His eyes moved quickly across the printed lines. His face changed. Wait, he said. Lauren frowned. What Michael didn't answer immediately. He kept reading. Victoria leaned over his shoulder. Charles was already halfway through the page. Lauren's patience snapped. Can someone explain what we're looking at? Michael finally looked up. His expression had shifted from mild irritation to something else entirely. Shock. Mom, he said slowly. Yes. You never told me about this. That's true. Lauren leaned forward and grabbed the letter. Her eyes moved rapidly across the page. At first she looked annoyed, then confused, then something closer to disbelief. This doesn't make sense, she said. It makes perfect sense, Charles said quietly. Lauren looked at him. What? Charles tapped the page. The waterfront property. Lauren's eyes flicked down to the line he indicated. Then she froze. What? Michael ran a hand through his hair. This says the property isn't individually owned. I nodded. That's correct. Lauren looked back and forth between us. What are you talking about? Michael pointed to the document. The Charleston waterfront parcel is held by the Allen Family Trust. Lauren frowned. So Michael continued reading, which means... His voice trailed off. I finished the sentence for him. It means I don't legally own it as a private individual. Victoria blinked. Charles leaned back slowly in his chair. Lauren looked irritated. I don't understand why that matters. It matters, Charles said quietly. Lauren turned to him. How Charles spoke carefully. Because if the property belongs to a trust, he tapped the document, then Frances cannot transfer it the way your development agreement requires. Lauren stared at him. You're saying she can't sign the contract? Charles nodded. Not under the terms presented tonight. Lauren turned to Michael. Is that true? Michael rubbed his forehead. Yes. Lauren's voice sharpened. Then why didn't you know this? Michael looked at me. You never told me. No, I said. Lauren leaned back in her chair. This is ridiculous. She pushed the letter across the table toward me. You're saying the property is locked inside a trust? Yes, and you can't transfer it. Not like that. Lauren looked furious. That land is essential to the entire development. Charles remained calm. Lauren, no, she snapped. We've been planning this project for months. Michael looked at me again. Mom, why didn't you tell me about the trust? I met his eyes. You never asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Victoria spoke gently. How long has the trust existed? 9 years, I said. Since Robert died. Yes. Charles nodded slowly. That was wise. Lauren stared at him. You're taking her side. I'm acknowledging legal reality, he replied. Lauren turned back to me. You knew about the redevelopment plans, I suspected, and you still didn't tell us the property was in a trust now. Lauren's voice rose slightly. That's incredibly misleading. I smiled faintly. Is it... Michael looked uneasy. Mom, this complicates things. Yes. Lauren slammed her hand lightly against the table. This destroys the entire structure. A nearby diner glanced over briefly before returning to his meal. Victoria whispered sharply. Lauren, but she was too angry to stop. You let us believe this land was available. I never said it was, I replied calmly. Lauren stared at me. You let us plan an entire investment around it. I didn't plan anything I said. Michael sighed heavily. Mom, his voice sounded tired now. When you said you owned the property, I said your father and I kept it. That implies ownership. I folded the letter carefully. It implies responsibility. Lauren shook her head. This is unbelievable. Charles spoke again, his tone thoughtful. Actually, it explains a great deal. Lauren glared at him. What does that mean? Charles gestured toward the documents. The development agreement assumes direct title transfer. He looked at me, which means the attorneys never verified the trust structure. Lauren turned to Michael again. Your firm prepared these documents. Michael's jaw tightened. They relied on public property records, and the trust isn't listed there. It's listed differently, he said. Lauren leaned back in her chair. So the entire deal falls apart because of paperwork. I placed the letter back inside the envelope. No, I said softly. The deal falls apart because you assumed something that wasn't true. Lauren's eyes narrowed. And what exactly did we assume? I closed my purse. That I didn't understand what you were trying to do. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Because for the first time that evening, they realized I had been paying attention all along. For several seconds, no one spoke. The candle between us flickered softly, casting long shadows across the table. Around us, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, servers gliding between tables, soft laughter from distant diners, the muted clink of glasses. But at our table, the air had changed. Lauren was staring at me as if she had just realized the rules of the game were different from what she thought. Michael looked unsettled. Charles Whitmore, however, looked thoughtful, and Victoria appeared quietly fascinated. Lauren was the first to break the silence. So let me get this straight, she said slowly. You knew about the development plans. You knew we were building an investment structure around that property. She gestured toward the documents. And you waited until tonight to mention that the land is locked inside a trust. I didn't wait, I said calmly. Lauren's eyebrows lifted. Oh, you never asked. Michael exhaled heavily and leaned back in his chair. That's technically true, he admitted. Lauren shot him a sharp look. Technically, Michael rubbed his temples. Lauren, the trust changes the legal framework. The property can't just be transferred the way we planned. Lauren crossed her arms. So what now? Charles spoke quietly. That depends on Francis. Everyone looked at me. The waiter approached the table just then with our appetizers. He placed the plates down, carefully seared scallops for Lauren, roasted duck for Charles, a salad for Victoria. He hesitated slightly when he noticed the tension. Then he nodded politely and stepped away. None of us touched the food. Lauren leaned forward again. Okay, she said. Fine. The land is inside a trust. That complicates the paperwork. Her tone shifted slightly, becoming more strategic. But trusts can still participate in development partnerships. Charles nodded. That's correct. Lauren looked back at me. So we simply adjust the agreement. Instead of transferring the land, the trust becomes a shareholder in the development company. Michael's eyes lit slightly. That could work, he said. Lauren smiled faintly. See, problem solved. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I reached into my purse again. Lauren noticed. Her expression tightened. What now? I pulled out my reading glasses once more and placed them on the table beside the envelope. Before we restructure anything, I said, there's something else you should understand about the trust. Michael looked wary. What do you mean? I took a slow sip of water. Then I spoke. The trust doesn't just hold the waterfront property. Lauren frowned. What else would it hold? Michael leaned forward. Mom, I folded my hands. When your father died, Robert and I had already sold most of Allen Textile Workshop. Michael nodded. I know that, but not all of it, I said. His eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? Charles watched me closely now, I continued. We kept certain assets, smaller things at the time. Lauren looked impatient. Like what real estate, I said. Charles nodded slightly. Smart. Lauren waved a hand. But that's still just one parcel of land. I shook my head gently. Not exactly. Michael blinked. How many? 3. The number seemed to settle over the table like a weight. Lauren stared at me. 3. Yes. Michael leaned forward quickly. We're Charleston, I said. Charles raised an eyebrow. The Port District? Yes. He leaned back slowly. That area is about to explode in value, I know. Lauren's voice sharpened. Wait, you're saying the trust owns multiple properties in the redevelopment zone? Yes. Michael looked stunned. Mom, those could be worth millions once the project begins. They already are, I replied quietly. Lauren stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. You never told us about any of this. No, I said. Why not? I looked directly at her. Because no one ever asked about my business. Lauren opened her mouth, closed it again. Victoria finally spoke. Francis, she said gently, that's quite an impressive portfolio. I smiled slightly. Robert was always good at seeing opportunity early. Michael leaned forward. So the trust holds 3 parcels? Yes. And the redevelopment district is expanding toward all of them? Yes. Michael sat back slowly. His mind was clearly racing. Lauren noticed. Her eyes lit with a new kind of excitement. While she said, her tone suddenly bright again, that actually makes this even better. Michael nodded cautiously. It could increase the project scale. Lauren leaned toward me. Francis, this changes everything. How so? Instead of 1 property, she said we could integrate all 3 into the master development. Charles remained quiet. Lauren continued. This would dramatically increase the value of the project. Michael looked hopeful. Mom, if the trust partnered with our company, I asked gently. Lauren smiled. Yes, Whitmore Development Holdings. Charles finally spoke. Lauren, she turned to him. What? He folded his hands calmly. We should slow down. Lauren frowned. Why? Charles looked at me. Because Frances hasn't said she's interested. Lauren waved that off. Of course she would be. I tilted my head slightly. Why do you assume that Lauren laughed softly? Because this could make everyone rich. Charles glanced at her again. Lauren, but she continued, you'd be part of a massive redevelopment project. Your land value would skyrocket. You'd finally be involved in something bigger than... Well, she gestured vaguely toward my dress. Small sewing businesses. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Lauren, but she didn't stop. You said yourself the land has just been sitting there. I studied her calmly. Did it occur to you that there might be a reason for that? Lauren blinked. What reason? I leaned slightly closer to the table. The trust has rules. Michael frowned. What kind of rules? I tapped the envelope again. The kind that limit how the assets can be used. Lauren looked irritated again. So change the rules. It's not that simple. Michael looked confused. Mom, you're the trustee, right? Yes. So you control the trust. No. Lauren stared at me. What do you mean, no? I spoke carefully. The Allen Family Trust has multiple trustees. Michael frowned. Who else? I met his eyes. Not you. Lauren scoffed. Well, obviously not. Charles leaned forward slightly. Who are the trustees? I smiled faintly. The bank. Lauren rolled her eyes. So a bank signs paperwork. That's manageable. Michael was already shaking his head. No, he said quietly. Lauren looked at him. What Michael spoke slowly. Private trust banks don't just rubber stamp decisions. Lauren frowned. They work with clients. Michael looked back at the letter. They protect the assets. Charles nodded quietly. That's their entire purpose. Lauren crossed her arms again. So what you're saying, she said to me, is that we just need the bank's approval. I looked at her. Perhaps. Lauren leaned forward confidently. Well, then let's arrange a meeting. Michael hesitated. Lauren. But she ignored him. She smiled at me. Francis, we'd be happy to discuss the development proposal with the bank. I watched her carefully. Then I asked a simple question. Why do you think the trust exists? Lauren shrugged. For tax benefits. Charles gave a quiet chuckle. But Lauren didn't notice. I looked around the table slowly. The trust exists, I said, to protect the assets from people who might try to take them. Lauren's smile disappeared. Michael stared at the table. Charles Whitmore finally leaned back in his chair, and for the first time that evening, he looked impressed. The moment I said the word protect, the entire tone of the table shifted again. Lauren's posture stiffened. Michael stared at the tablecloth like he had suddenly discovered something fascinating about the stitching. Charles Whitmore leaned back in his chair, slowly studying me with a kind of quiet curiosity. Victoria folded her hands neatly in front of her plate, and the appetizers on the table had gone completely untouched. Lauren recovered first. Her smile returned, but this time it looked carefully controlled. Well, she said lightly, I'm sure the trust was created with good intentions. I didn't respond. She continued, but no one here is trying to take anything from you. I tilted my head slightly. Is that what you believe? Lauren's eyes narrowed a fraction. Yes. Michael shifted in his chair. Mom, he said quietly. Lauren doesn't mean I raised a hand gently. It's all right. Then I looked directly at Lauren. You're right, I said. No one used the word take tonight. Lauren gave a satisfied nod. But contracts don't need that word, I continued calmly. Michael rubbed his forehead again. Lauren's smile faded slightly. What exactly are you implying? I tapped the stack of documents again. These papers would transfer permanent control of my land to your development company. That's how projects like this work, she replied quickly. Perhaps I said. Michael leaned forward. Mom, listen. The goal isn't to take anything from you. The goal is to maximize the value of the land. Victoria nodded. That's true. Charles spoke quietly. In real estate, unused property can represent lost opportunity. I met his eyes. Opportunity for whom he didn't answer immediately. Lauren jumped in again. For everyone involved, she said. Michael nodded. Yes, the entire family benefits. I folded my hands. The entire family. Lauren gave a quick laugh. Of course. I pointed to the documents again. Then why does the ownership structure list only 2 managing partners? Michael froze. Lauren's voice tightened. Because Michael and I would handle operations and the profit distribution, I asked. Michael looked uncomfortable now. That's standard corporate governance. Lauren leaned forward. Francis, these are extremely common structures. Yes, I said softly. They are. Charles raised an eyebrow. Lauren noticed. What she asked. Charles didn't answer. He was watching me again. I turned another page of the documents. There's something interesting here, I said. Michael shifted. What clause 18? Lauren exhaled loudly. Do we really need to read every clause? Yes, I said. Michael glanced at the page. His face changed again. Oh, he said quietly. Lauren looked at him. What now? Michael didn't respond immediately. I read the clause out loud. Managing partners maintain unilateral authority to sell, refinance, or restructure any property held by the development entity. Lauren shrugged. That's normal. I continued reading. Original asset contributors waive all veto authority once the property is transferred. Victoria frowned slightly. Charles leaned forward again. Michael stared at the table. Lauren looked irritated. Francis, if you're trying to suggest something unethical. I'm not suggesting anything I said. I'm simply reading what your lawyers wrote. Lauren crossed her arms. You're twisting the meaning. Michael spoke quietly. No, she isn't. Lauren turned toward him sharply. What? Michael looked uneasy. The clause does allow the managing partners to sell the property without additional approval. Lauren scoffed. That's standard. Michael nodded slowly. Yes. Then he added something that made Lauren turn toward him fully. But the trust wouldn't benefit from the sale the way we described. Lauren stared at him. What are you talking about? Michael pointed to the page. The profit distribution happens after debt restructuring. Lauren blinked. So Michael looked at me. Mom's land would essentially become collateral. Lauren's jaw tightened. That's not how I explained it. Michael looked tired. That's how it reads. Charles let out a slow breath. Well, he said quietly, that complicates things. Lauren looked furious now. Nothing is complicated. She turned toward me. You're making this into something it isn't. I watched her calmly. Am I? Yes. She leaned closer across the table. We're offering you a chance to be part of a project that could make your land worth 20 times what it is now. And if I decline, Lauren shrugged. Then you'd be wasting an extraordinary opportunity. Michael looked uncomfortable again. Lauren. But she continued. That land has been sitting there doing absolutely nothing for years. I said nothing. Lauren shook her head. Honestly, Francis, you're holding onto it like it's some kind of sentimental museum piece. Charles spoke quietly. Lauren. But she wasn't finished. Meanwhile, the entire Charleston waterfront is transforming into a luxury district. She gestured around the restaurant. Places like this are being built everywhere down there. Michael looked down at the table. Lauren's voice sharpened further. And you're sitting on land that could fund half a dozen projects. Victoria finally spoke. Lauren, that's enough. Lauren leaned back in her chair. I'm just being honest. Silence fell over the table again. Then Charles Whitmore spoke. His voice was calm. Francis. Yes, I'm curious about something. I waited. He nodded toward the trust letter. You mentioned the trust has rules. Yes. What kind of rules? Michael looked up slightly. I answered carefully. The trust limits how the assets can be sold or transferred. Charles nodded. That's typical. But there's more, I said. Lauren rolled her eyes. Of course there is. I ignored her. The trust also requires approval from the trustees before any major development agreement can be signed. Michael frowned. But you said you were a trustee. I am. And the bank? Yes. Michael looked confused. So, what's the issue? I looked at him. The issue, I said gently, is that the bank has already reviewed development proposals for that property. Lauren froze. What? Michael blinked. When? A few months ago. Lauren's voice rose. You never told us that. No, I said. Charles leaned forward quickly. Who submitted the proposal? I met his gaze. Your firm. Lauren's eyes widened. That's impossible. Michael looked stunned. Our firm? Yes. Michael's voice dropped. You mean Whitmore Development? Yes. Lauren stared at me. Then why didn't they approve it? I folded my hands again. The bank didn't reject it. Lauren leaned forward. Then what? I held her gaze. They postponed the decision. Why? I paused. Then I answered. Because they wanted to see how tonight's meeting would unfold. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before. Michael stared at me. Lauren's face had gone pale. Charles Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair. And for the first time since the dinner began, Lauren looked uncertain. Because the dinner she thought she controlled had actually been watched from the very beginning. For a long moment, the table was completely silent. Lauren was the first one who moved. She leaned back slowly in her chair as if physically creating distance from the conversation. Michael stared at me. You're saying he began slowly that the bank already reviewed the proposal from Whitmore Development? Yes. And they knew about tonight, yes. Lauren's eyes widened. That's absurd. Her voice had lost its earlier confidence. Now it sounded sharper defensive. No bank sits around monitoring family dinners. I shrugged lightly. Most banks probably don't. Charles Whitmore didn't say anything, but he was watching me very carefully now. Michael spoke again. Mom, when did they review the proposal? About 2 months ago. Michael looked shocked. That was before we even finalized the paperwork. Yes, Lauren frowned. How would they have known about the project that early Charles answered quietly? Because real estate developers talk. Lauren looked at him. What does that mean? Charles folded his hands on the table. It means people in this industry hear about opportunities long before contracts appear. Michael looked down at the documents again. Lauren looked irritated. Well, even if they reviewed it, she said that doesn't change anything. I raised an eyebrow. No. She pointed at the envelope. You said they postponed the decision. That means they're still considering it. Michael nodded slowly. That's true. Lauren leaned forward again, trying to reclaim the authority she had earlier. So what exactly were they waiting for? I met her eyes. They wanted to see how this conversation went. Lauren blinked. That's ridiculous. Michael spoke quietly. Why would they care about that? Because the trust has a responsibility clause. Michael frowned. What kind of clause? The kind that evaluates the integrity of development partners. Lauren let out a short laugh. Oh, please. Charles raised a hand slightly. Let her finish. I nodded at him before continuing. The bank's legal department reviews not only the financial structure of a deal, but also the character of the people involved. Lauren rolled her eyes. This isn't a charity foundation. No, I said. It's a protective trust. Michael rubbed his forehead again. So what does that mean for the proposal? It means the bank wanted to see whether the people requesting the land would treat the trustee with respect. Lauren stared at me. You're serious? Yes. Victoria spoke softly. That's actually very common with family trusts. Lauren turned toward her mother. You can't be serious. Victoria shrugged slightly. Large trusts often include ethical review clauses. Charles nodded. It's a way to avoid conflicts of interest. Lauren looked frustrated. So what this entire dinner was some kind of test I didn't answer. Michael looked uneasy. Mom, I took a slow sip of water before speaking. When your father and I created the trust, I said we knew the land might become valuable someday. Michael nodded faintly. Okay, but Robert also worried about something else. Lauren crossed her arms. What he worried that success might change the way people treat each other. Michael looked down. Lauren scoffed. That's a bit dramatic. Charles spoke quietly. No, it isn't. Lauren looked at him again. What Charles leaned forward slightly. Money reveals character. Victoria nodded gently. Michael's voice was quieter now. So the bank wanted to see how we treated you tonight. Yes. Lauren let out a long breath. Well then, I'm sure they'll be thrilled to hear we invited you into a multi-million-dollar development. Michael looked at her. Lauren continued. We're literally offering her a massive opportunity. I tilted my head slightly. Is that how you see it? Lauren frowned. Yes. I looked at Michael. What about you? Michael hesitated. I thought it would be good for everyone. And if the land had been transferred tonight, I asked. Michael looked at the documents again. Lauren answered instead. Then the project would move forward. And the trust would lose control of its assets, I said. Lauren shook her head. You'd gain profit. Charles spoke quietly. Lauren. She turned toward him again. What? Charles sighed. You're missing the point. Lauren's patience snapped. No, I'm not. She turned toward me. You're acting like we're trying to steal something. No, I said calmly. I'm acting like someone tried to trick me. Michael flinched. Lauren's eyes flashed. That's ridiculous. I tapped the stack of documents again. Then why wasn't the trust structure verified before tonight? Michael opened his mouth, closed it. Lauren answered quickly. Because we assumed... She stopped mid-sentence. The word hung there in the air. Assumed. Charles leaned back slowly. Yes, he said quietly. That's exactly the problem. Lauren glared at him. Whose side are you on? Charles smiled faintly, the side of reality. Victoria hid a small smile. Lauren turned back to me. So what now? I folded the envelope again and placed it back inside my purse. Now the bank will make its decision. Lauren crossed her arms. And when will that be? Soon. Michael looked worried. What does soon mean? I looked at him gently. Tomorrow. Lauren laughed again. Oh, great. She leaned back in her chair. So the bank gets to decide whether this development happens? Yes. Michael looked anxious. And what are they deciding exactly? They're deciding whether the people who want access to the trust's assets can be trusted. Lauren shook her head. This is unbelievable. I looked at her calmly. Is it? She gestured around the table. You're letting strangers decide whether your own son can work with you. Michael looked uncomfortable. Charles spoke quietly. That's not entirely unfair. Lauren looked at him again. You're siding with her again. Charles shrugged. I'm acknowledging the structure of the trust. Lauren leaned back with a frustrated sigh. Well, if the bank wants to judge us, she said, I hope they understand the kind of opportunity they're turning down. I looked at her. Opportunity for whom she didn't answer. Michael stared down at the documents. Charles slowly finished his wine. And for the first time that evening, the energy at the table had completely reversed, because the people who believed they were in control of the deal now realized they weren't the ones making the decision. For a few minutes after that, none of us spoke. The waiter returned quietly and began clearing the untouched appetizers. The scallops Lauren had ordered were still perfectly arranged on the plate, the sauce undisturbed. My salad had barely been touched. He worked with the careful professionalism of someone who had learned long ago not to interrupt difficult conversations. When he finished, he asked gently, Would anyone like another glass of wine, no? Lauren said quickly. Michael shook his head. Charles and Victoria declined politely. The waiter nodded and left. Lauren let out a slow breath. So she said, leaning back in her chair, we're all just supposed to sit here and wait for some bank to judge us. No one is judging you, I said. Lauren laughed sharply. Really, because that's exactly what it sounds like. Michael spoke quietly. Lauren, the trust structure was created long before this project. She turned to him. And you didn't know about it? Michael looked embarrassed. No. Lauren shook her head. That's unbelievable. She turned toward me again. You never told your own son about a multi-million-dollar trust. I met her gaze calmly. You never asked. Lauren looked like she wanted to argue again, but Charles spoke before she could. Francis, he said thoughtfully, I have a question. Yes. When the bank reviewed the development proposal earlier this year, did they speak with you about it? Yes. Lauren rolled her eyes. Of course they did. Charles ignored her. And what did you tell them? I told them I hadn't been approached yet. Michael frowned. So they knew we hadn't talked to you, yes. Charles nodded slowly. That would concern them. Lauren scoffed. Oh, please. Victoria spoke gently. Why does it concern them? Charles answered. Because if someone is negotiating access to trust assets without first speaking to the trustee, it suggests they're trying to structure the deal before obtaining consent. Lauren turned toward him again. Which is normal in business. Charles shook his head slightly. Not when the trustee is family. Lauren leaned back with a frustrated sigh. This entire conversation is ridiculous. Michael rubbed his temples again. Lauren, maybe we should slow down. No, she said. I want to understand what's happening. She turned toward me again. So the bank reviewed the proposal months ago. Yes. They knew about the land. Yes. They knew Whitmore Development was involved. Yes. Lauren leaned forward, and they still haven't made a decision. Correct. Lauren tapped the table. Which means they're undecided. Perhaps, Charles spoke quietly. Or they were waiting. Lauren looked at him. For what? Charles glanced toward me. For this. Lauren followed his gaze. Then she shook her head. You're all acting like this dinner is some kind of legal hearing. Michael spoke softly. Maybe it is. Lauren stared at him. What Michael looked at the envelope on the table. If the trust has ethical clauses, then the bank would want to know how the partners behave. Lauren laughed again, though this time it sounded less confident. So they're evaluating our manners. Now Victoria spoke carefully. Not manners. Intentions. Lauren threw her hands up slightly. Oh, come on. Charles leaned forward again. Lauren, if someone approached you asking to place a multi-million-dollar asset into your company. She looked at him. Wouldn't you want to know what kind of people they were? Lauren hesitated. Then she looked away. Michael spoke quietly. Mom? Yes. Did the bank say anything else? I considered the question. Yes. Lauren groaned. Of course they did. Michael ignored her. What did they say? They asked me a very simple question. Michael waited. So did Charles and Victoria. Lauren crossed her arms impatiently. Well, they asked. I said whether I believed the people involved in the project truly valued the family behind the assets. Michael looked uncomfortable. Lauren scoffed. That's not a financial question. No, I said, it's a trust question. Lauren shook her head. This is unbelievable. Charles spoke quietly. It's actually very old-fashioned. Lauren frowned. What do you mean family trusts used to evaluate character as carefully as profit? Victoria nodded gently. It was meant to prevent exactly this kind of conflict. Lauren leaned forward again. Conflict. She pointed toward me. She's the one turning this into a conflict. Michael spoke softly. Lauren. But she continued. We invited her into a development worth millions. She gestured around the restaurant. And she's treating us like criminals. I looked at her calmly. I'm treating you like business partners. Lauren blinked. What business partners? I repeated. You asked me to sign a contract. That makes this a business conversation. Lauren's expression tightened. Michael spoke again. Mom, if the bank approves the partnership, would you consider it? The question hung in the air. Lauren watched me closely. So did Charles. Victoria seemed curious. I thought about it for a moment before answering. Yes. Lauren's posture straightened immediately. See, she said. Michael looked relieved, but only under one condition, I added. Lauren's smile faded slightly. What condition? I looked at Michael first, then Lauren, then Charles. The partnership would have to be fair. Lauren frowned. It is fair, not the way the contract is written. Michael looked back at the documents. What would you change? I tapped the ownership structure. The trust would remain the majority owner of the land. Lauren's eyes widened. That's impossible. Charles said nothing. I continued. The development company would act as a management partner, not the controlling entity. Michael looked thoughtful. That would change the entire capital structure. Yes. Lauren shook her head. That defeats the purpose of the project. Charles finally spoke. No, it doesn't. Lauren looked at him again. What it simply means the trust retains power. Lauren leaned back again, clearly frustrated. This is turning into a negotiation. Yes, I said, that's what it should have been from the beginning. Michael looked between us. Mom. Yes. Did the bank say whether they would approve the project? I met his eyes. They said the decision would depend on whether the partners demonstrated integrity. Lauren muttered under her breath. This is insane. Charles slowly finished the last sip of his wine. Then he set the glass down and looked directly at me. Well, Francis, he said thoughtfully, I suppose the bank will have quite a lot to think about tomorrow. I smiled slightly. Yes, and for the first time since the dinner began, Charles Whitmore looked genuinely impressed because he understood something Lauren still hadn't realized. The dinner wasn't about the land anymore. It was about the kind of people who wanted it. The plates from dinner arrived a few minutes later. Steak for Michael, roasted salmon for Victoria, a lamb dish for Charles, and a carefully arranged pasta plate for Lauren. The food looked extraordinary, but the table still felt tense. Lauren picked up her fork and pushed the pasta slightly around the plate without actually eating it. Michael stared at his steak as if he had forgotten how knives worked. Charles, however, seemed perfectly calm. He cut a small piece of lamb and tasted it thoughtfully. Excellent, he murmured. Victoria smiled faintly and began eating her salmon. I took a bite of my own meal, simple grilled chicken with vegetables, and found that I was suddenly quite hungry. It's funny how the body works. Even in the middle of complicated conversations, life goes on. Lauren finally broke the silence again, so she said, her voice tight, We're really doing this. Michael glanced at her. Doing what? Pretending this is some kind of moral test. Michael sighed. Lauren, but she was already turning toward me. Francis, with all due respect, development deals don't run on personality reviews. I swallowed my bite of food calmly. Some trusts do. Lauren shook her head. You're turning a business proposal into a philosophical debate. Charles spoke quietly. Perhaps the two aren't so different. Lauren looked at him again. You're siding with her again. Charles didn't seem bothered. I'm acknowledging the reality of this situation. Lauren leaned back in her chair. This is absurd. Michael set his fork down. Lauren, maybe we should just focus on the practical side of this. She looked at him. Fine. Then she turned back to me. You said the trust requires approval from the bank and the trustees. Yes. And the bank is deciding tomorrow. Yes. Lauren exhaled sharply. Then I suppose we'll all just wait. Michael looked uneasy. Mom, did they say anything else? I nodded. They asked me another question. Lauren groaned softly. Of course they did. Michael leaned forward. What question? They asked whether the family relationship would survive the business partnership. Michael looked confused. What does that mean? I looked at him carefully. It means they were concerned about whether this deal was truly about opportunity or pressure. Lauren's voice rose immediately. Pressure, yes. That's ridiculous. Michael spoke quietly. Lauren, but she was already looking at me. You think we're pressuring you? I think the documents assumed I would sign without reading them? Lauren scoffed. That's how business moves quickly. I shook my head gently. That's how mistakes happen. Michael looked uncomfortable again. Lauren leaned forward across the table. You're acting like we tried to deceive you. I'm acting like the contract would remove my control over family assets. Lauren's jaw tightened. Assets that could make everyone here a fortune. I met her gaze. Is that the only reason you want them? She blinked. What kind of question is that? A simple one. Michael spoke carefully. Mom, the project would genuinely increase the value of the land, yes, I said. And it would increase the value of Whitmore development as well. Lauren nodded immediately. Exactly. Charles watched quietly. Michael looked between us. But that doesn't mean the intentions are bad. No, I said, it doesn't. Lauren leaned back again. Then what exactly is the problem? I placed my fork down. The problem, I said softly, is respect. Lauren stared at me. What I looked at Michael. Your father and I spent 30 years building our business. Michael nodded slowly. I know. We sacrificed a great deal. I know. I glanced at Lauren, but tonight the first thing anyone noticed was my dress. Lauren flushed slightly. That was a joke. Was it? She hesitated. Victoria spoke gently. Lauren, perhaps that wasn't the best moment. Lauren looked irritated. It was harmless. Charles raised an eyebrow. Was it? Lauren sighed loudly. Oh, come on. Michael looked embarrassed. Lauren, maybe we should just know, she said sharply. Then she turned back to me. You're saying the entire deal is now in danger because of a comment about your dress. No, I said calmly. I'm saying the comment revealed something. Michael frowned. What, that you assumed I didn't belong in this room? Lauren laughed again. That's not what I meant, but it's what you believed. She shook her head. You're being overly sensitive. Charles spoke quietly. Francis may not be wrong. Lauren looked at him again. Seriously. Charles folded his hands calmly. People reveal their assumptions in small moments. Victoria nodded softly. Lauren leaned back again, clearly annoyed. Well, if the bank is judging us based on dinner conversation, that's ridiculous. I picked up my glass of water. Perhaps, Michael spoke again. Mom, what happens if the bank rejects the partnership? I met his eyes. Then the trust continues, as it always has, and the land remains under the trust's control. Lauren shook her head. So the redevelopment opportunity disappears. Not necessarily. Michael frowned. What do you mean the trust can partner with other developers? Lauren stared at me. You're serious? Yes. Her voice sharpened. You'd rather work with strangers than with your own family. I thought about that for a moment. Then I answered honestly. I'd rather work with people who respect the family behind the assets. Lauren's eyes flashed. Michael looked deeply uncomfortable. Charles spoke quietly. That's a reasonable position. Lauren stared at him. You're unbelievable. Victoria sighed softly. Lauren. But Lauren was too frustrated to stop now. You're all acting like this is some kind of moral drama. I looked at her calmly. No. Then what is it? It's a reminder of what that wealth doesn't erase where it came from. The table fell quiet again. Michael stared down at his plate. Lauren said nothing. Charles slowly nodded. And for a moment, the only sound in the restaurant was the quiet clinking of silverware, because even Lauren Whitmore seemed to realize something then. The dinner she thought was about money was actually about something much harder to negotiate, respect. For a while after that, the conversation slowed. Not completely, but the energy had changed. Lauren no longer spoke as quickly. Michael looked like a man trying to solve a problem he hadn't expected to face tonight. Charles remained thoughtful occasionally, asking practical questions about the trust structure. Victoria mostly listened. Dinner eventually ended. The waiter cleared the plates, replaced them with small dessert menus, and asked politely whether we would like coffee or tea. Lauren declined immediately. Michael asked for coffee. Charles ordered an espresso. Victoria chose herbal tea. I asked for black coffee. When the waiter left, Michael leaned forward again. "Mom," he said quietly. "Yes, I want to understand something." Lauren rolled her eyes slightly but said nothing. Michael continued. "You said the trust was created 9 years ago, right after Dad died. That's right, and you never told me about it." "No." He frowned slightly. Why I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Because at the time you had just started your legal career." He nodded. "Yes, you were working 80 hours a week, sometimes more, and you were trying to build your life." Michael looked confused. So I didn't think it was necessary." Lauren scoffed quietly. "That doesn't make sense." Michael raised a hand slightly toward her. "Let her finish." I continued. "Your father and I had already decided what the trust would do." Michael leaned closer. "What do you mean the trust wasn't only about the land? What else? It was about protecting the future of the family." Lauren laughed softly. "By hiding millions of dollars from your own son." Michael looked uncomfortable. "Lauren," but she kept going. "That's not protection, that's secrecy." I looked at her calmly. "Not everything that is private is secret." Lauren crossed her arms again. "Well, it certainly wasn't transparent." Michael spoke carefully. "Mom, was I ever supposed to know about the trust? Yes. When the time was right." Lauren rolled her eyes again. "And when exactly would that be?" I met her gaze. "When I believed the information would be treated responsibly." She stared at me. "So you didn't trust your own son?" Michael flinched slightly at that. I looked at him. "I trusted the young man who graduated from law school." Michael looked down. Lauren leaned forward. "And what about the man sitting here now?" I paused. The silence lasted long enough for Michael to look back up. Then I answered. "I'm still deciding." Michael looked like someone had just taken the air out of the room. Lauren shook her head. "This is unbelievable." Charles spoke quietly. "It's honest." Lauren turned toward him again. "You're defending her again." Charles shrugged lightly. "I'm acknowledging reality." Victoria stirred her tea gently. Michael spoke again. "Mom, do you think I've changed?" I studied his face carefully. "You've grown." "That's not what I asked." "No," I said softly, "it isn't." He waited. Then I continued. "You used to ask questions." Michael frowned. "What kind of questions? Questions about how things worked?" He nodded slowly. "You used to be curious about the textile business." "Yes." "You used to sit in the workshop and watch your father repair machines." Michael smiled faintly at the memory. "I remember that, but somewhere along the way I said you stopped asking how things were built." Lauren muttered under her breath. "Oh my God." Michael ignored her. "What do you mean?" I said gently, "you became more interested in how things could be acquired." Michael looked down again. Lauren scoffed. "That's called ambition." Charles spoke quietly. "Ambition and acquisition aren't the same thing." Lauren looked irritated. "Well, excuse me for wanting success." No one answered that. Michael finally spoke again. "Mom, if the trust was meant to protect the family..." "Yes, does that mean I'm part of it?" I nodded, yes. Lauren leaned forward quickly. "Wait," she looked at me. "You're saying Michael is a beneficiary?" "Yes." Her eyes widened, of how much Michael looked embarrassed. "Lauren..." But she continued, "How much is he supposed to inherit?" I smiled faintly. "That depends." "On what? On the trust conditions?" Lauren leaned back. "You're kidding, no." Michael spoke quietly. "What conditions?" I folded my hands on the table. "The trust includes something called a character clause." Lauren laughed again. "That sounds ridiculous." Charles spoke calmly. "It's actually quite common in older family trusts." Victoria nodded. "It encourages responsible stewardship." Lauren shook her head. "So what does it mean?" I looked at Michael. "It means beneficiaries must demonstrate good judgment in financial decisions." Michael frowned. "What counts as good judgment? Respect for the family assets." Lauren scoffed. "And who decides that? The trustees?" Michael looked worried now. "You and the bank." "Yes." Lauren leaned forward again. "So if the bank doesn't approve this deal..." Michael finished the sentence quietly. "It reflects badly on me." "Yes." Lauren stared at me. "You're threatening your own son's inheritance?" I shook my head. "No." "What then? I'm protecting it." Lauren leaned back with a frustrated sigh. "This whole thing feels like some kind of trap." I looked at her calmly. "It isn't a trap. Then what is it? I met her eyes. It's a test. Lauren laughed again. A test? Yes. For what? I looked at Michael. For whether the next generation understands what it means to build something instead of just taking it. The table went quiet again. Michael stared at the documents in front of him. Lauren looked furious. Charles looked thoughtful. Victoria looked almost proud. And in that moment, Michael finally seemed to understand something he hadn't seen before. This dinner was never really about the land. It was about whether he deserved to inherit the work that built it. For a long moment after I said the word test, the entire table fell quiet. Not the polite silence we had been dancing around all evening. A real silence. The kind that settles when people realize a conversation has moved somewhere deeper than they expected. Michael stared down at the documents again. Lauren stared at me. Charles Whitmore slowly stirred his espresso. Victoria folded her hands neatly in her lap. Finally, Lauren broke the silence. "You're serious," she said. "Yes." Her voice sharpened. "So this entire situation is some kind of evaluation?" "It always was." Lauren let out a disbelieving laugh. "That's insane." Michael spoke quietly. "Lauren," but she ignored him, "you're testing your own son like he's applying for a job." "No," I said calmly. "I'm observing him like someone who may one day control the work your father and I spent our lives building." Michael flinched slightly at that. Lauren leaned forward. "So the trust decides whether Michael is worthy now. The trustees evaluate how responsibly the assets might be managed." Lauren shook her head. "This is unbelievable," Charles spoke quietly. "It's actually quite traditional." Lauren turned toward him again. "You're not helping." Charles didn't seem bothered. Family wealth has been destroyed by careless decisions for centuries. Victoria nodded softly. "That's why many trusts include safeguards." Lauren leaned back again. "Well, apparently the safeguard is humiliating your son in a restaurant." Michael looked at her. "Lauren, this isn't humiliation." Lauren laughed again. "Oh, really?" Michael hesitated. Then he spoke more quietly. "No. It's accountability." Lauren stared at him as if she didn't recognize the person speaking. "What are you talking about?" Michael looked down at the stack of documents again. Then he looked at me. "You read every page." "Yes. And you understood all of it." "Yes." Lauren scoffed. "That's not impressive. It's just a contract." Michael shook his head slightly. "No," he said softly. "It's more than that." Lauren looked at him. "What?" Michael pointed to the ownership structure. "This deal gives Lauren and me total control over the property." Lauren frowned. "Because we'd be managing the project," Michael continued, "and it removes the trust's veto power." Lauren shrugged. "That's standard." Michael looked tired, "but it also allows the property to be leveraged as collateral." Lauren hesitated. So Michael looked at her carefully. "So if the project failed—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Lauren's eyes narrowed. "You're exaggerating." Charles spoke calmly. "He isn't." Lauren turned toward her father again. "Seriously." Charles nodded. "The contract does expose the land to risk." Lauren crossed her arms. "Well, every investment involves risk." "Yes," Charles said. "But the question is, who carries that risk?" Lauren looked annoyed. "Everyone involved." Charles shook his head. "No." He tapped the document. "The trust carries most of it." Michael leaned back slowly in his chair. And suddenly, he looked much younger. Less like a confident corporate lawyer. More like the boy who used to sit at our kitchen table asking how sewing machines worked. Lauren looked between us. "You're all acting like this project is dangerous." "It's ambitious," Charles said. Lauren scoffed. "Which is why it will be profitable." I spoke quietly. "Ambition without caution can destroy things." Lauren looked directly at me. "You're saying we're reckless. I'm saying you assumed control before earning trust." Michael closed his eyes for a moment. Lauren shook her head again. "You know what I think I waited. I think you're uncomfortable with the scale of this project." Michael looked at her. "Lauren." But she kept going. "You built a small textile company decades ago." She gestured toward the documents. "This is modern development." Michael's face tightened slightly, but I answered calmly, "You may be right." Lauren blinked. "What?" "Perhaps I am uncomfortable with certain kinds of growth." She smiled slightly. "Finally, but not for the reasons you think." Lauren frowned. "What reasons?" I leaned back slightly in my chair. "The textile workshop your father and I built started with 2 sewing machines." Michael nodded faintly. Lauren said nothing. We grew slowly, I continued. Every expansion happened after we knew we could sustain it. Lauren sighed. That's small business thinking. Charles raised an eyebrow. Small businesses built most of the American economy. Lauren waved that off. That's not how development works. Maybe not, I said. But the principle is the same. Michael looked thoughtful. Lauren leaned forward again. So what exactly are you trying to prove? I looked at her calmly. I'm trying to understand the people who want to control family assets. Lauren laughed again. Control, yes. That's not control, it's ownership. Michael spoke quietly. Lauren, maybe we should slow down. She looked at him. Why? Because Mom has a point. Lauren stared at him. You're taking her side now. Michael rubbed his forehead. I'm trying to understand the situation. Lauren leaned back with a frustrated sigh. This is unbelievable. Charles finally spoke again. Francis. Yes, you said the bank would make its decision tomorrow. Yes, what exactly will they be deciding? I looked at him. They will decide whether Whitmore Development is an appropriate partner for the trust. Lauren crossed her arms. And if they decide we aren't, then the trust will decline the partnership. Lauren's voice sharpened again. And the land will remain in the trust. Michael asked quietly. And the redevelopment, I met his eyes. The redevelopment will still happen. Lauren frowned. What does that mean? It means other developers are interested. Lauren stared at me. You've been talking to other companies? Yes. Her jaw tightened. Since when? For several months. Michael looked stunned. Mom, why didn't you tell us? I answered honestly. Because I wanted to see how you approached the conversation first. Lauren let out a disbelieving laugh. So this really was a test. Yes. Michael looked down again. Lauren shook her head. You know what the funny part is? What you're acting like you hold all the power here. I looked at her calmly. I don't. Lauren leaned forward. Then who does? I smiled slightly. The people who built the assets. Lauren opened her mouth to respond, but Charles spoke first, and his voice carried a quiet authority. Lauren, he said tonight, you may want to listen more carefully. Lauren turned toward him, while Charles looked directly at me. Because Frances Allen is not the person you thought she was, and for the first time that evening, Lauren Whitmore looked genuinely uncertain. Lauren's uncertainty lasted only a moment. Then the familiar sharpness returned to her eyes. I never thought Frances was anything she said coolly. I simply thought we were discussing a development project. Charles looked at her calmly, and yet the conversation seems to have surprised you. Lauren's jaw tightened, because it's unnecessarily complicated. Michael exhaled slowly. Lauren. But she was already looking back at me. You said other developers are interested in the land. Yes, who I took a sip of coffee before answering. A few firms in Charleston. Lauren laughed quietly. Small firms, I assume. Charles watched her carefully. They're not small, I said. Michael leaned forward slightly. Mom, are they serious proposals? Yes. Lauren waved her hand dismissively. Everyone makes proposals when land becomes valuable. That's true, I said, but not everyone offers fair partnerships. Lauren raised an eyebrow. And you think we didn't? I held her gaze. The contract suggests otherwise. Michael rubbed his temples again. Lauren leaned forward. You're exaggerating the risks. No, the land would increase in value immediately. Yes, and the trust would profit. Possibly. Lauren's voice sharpened again. So what exactly is the issue? I looked at Michael. Then I answered. The issue is who controls the future of the property. Lauren scoffed. Control is necessary in development. Charles nodded slowly. That part is true. Lauren pointed at him. See, Charles continued calmly, but responsible control requires mutual respect. Lauren rolled her eyes. Oh, please. Michael looked at her. Lauren. But she didn't stop. You're all treating this like a philosophical debate instead of a business opportunity. I folded my hands calmly on the table. Business opportunities still involve values. Lauren leaned back in her chair. No, they involve results. Michael spoke quietly. Lauren, maybe we should just know, she interrupted. She turned toward me again. You keep talking about respect. Yes. What exactly does that mean to you? I thought about that for a moment. Then I answered honestly. It means recognizing the work that built the assets you want to control. Lauren's voice hardened. I recognize that. Do you? Yes. Then why did you laugh at my dress? The question landed heavily. Lauren blinked. That was a joke. Michael looked uncomfortable again. Charles watched silently. Victoria stirred her tea. I continued. That dress was the one I wore the day Michael graduated from law school. Michael looked up quickly. You still have that dress, yes. His expression softened slightly. Lauren frowned. I didn't know that. No, I said gently. You didn't ask. Lauren looked irritated again. So now this is about nostalgia. No, what then? It's about memory. Michael spoke softly. I remember that day. I smiled faintly. You were very proud. He nodded. Lauren looked between us. What does that have to do with the development? I answered calmly. Everything. She frowned. I don't see how. Michael spoke before I could. Because the land exists because of the business Mom and Dad built. Lauren shrugged. So Michael looked at her. So the land represents their work. Lauren sighed. That doesn't change the economics. No, Michael said, but it changes the responsibility. Lauren stared at him. You're serious. Michael nodded slowly. Charles smiled faintly. Victoria looked pleased. Lauren leaned back again. I can't believe this. Michael spoke quietly. Lauren, maybe we approached this the wrong way. She turned toward him sharply. What do you mean we should have talked to Mom before drafting the contract? Lauren shook her head. That's not how deals start. Michael looked at the documents again. Maybe it should be. Lauren's voice grew colder. You're backing away from the project now. No? Then what? Michael looked at me. Mom, if the trust rejects the partnership, would you still consider working with us later? I studied his face. For the first time that evening, he didn't look defensive. He looked thoughtful. Possibly, I said. Lauren scoffed. Unbelievable. Michael ignored her. What would need to change, I answered honestly. The structure. Lauren threw up her hands. So we're back to that again. Michael looked at her. Lauren, listen. No, please. She leaned forward again. You're about to walk away from a massive project because your mother doesn't like the contract. Michael spoke carefully. It's not about liking the contract. Then what? It's about whether the partnership makes sense. Lauren stared at him. You're doubting the project now? Michael hesitated. Then he spoke slowly. I'm questioning how we approached it. Lauren leaned back with a sharp laugh. This is ridiculous. Charles spoke quietly. Perhaps it's progress. Lauren glared at him. Whose side are you on tonight? Charles smiled slightly. The side that avoids unnecessary mistakes. Lauren shook her head. Michael looked at me again. Mom, if the bank approves the partnership tomorrow, would you still require a new structure? Yes. Lauren groaned. Of course. Michael nodded slowly. What kind of structure? The trust retains ownership of the land. Lauren rolled her eyes. And we already know that won't work. Charles spoke calmly. It could. Lauren turned toward him again. You're encouraging this. Charles shrugged lightly. A management partnership with trust ownership isn't unusual. Lauren stared at him. You're serious? Yes. Michael looked thoughtful again. That would require a different financing structure. Charles nodded. But it would reduce the risk to the trust. Lauren shook her head. This is turning into a completely different project. Yes, I said, perhaps a better one. Lauren leaned back with a frustrated sigh. This dinner was supposed to be simple. Michael looked at her. Maybe that was the problem. Lauren stared at him. What? Michael gestured toward the documents. We tried to make it simple by assuming too much. Lauren said nothing. Charles quietly finished his espresso. Victoria smiled gently, and for the first time that evening, Michael seemed to understand something his father had known long ago. Building something valuable takes time, but losing it can happen very quickly. By the time dessert arrived, the tension at the table had softened but not disappeared. Small plates of chocolate torte and lemon tart were placed in front of us, delicate and carefully decorated. The restaurant lights had dimmed slightly as the evening grew later, and the city skyline outside the tall windows shimmered with 1,000 quiet lights. For a while, no one spoke. Michael stared at the dessert in front of him, but didn't touch it. Lauren picked at the edge of her lemon tart with visible impatience. Charles seemed thoughtful. Victoria looked quietly relieved that the earlier sharpness in the conversation had faded. I took a small bite of the chocolate torte. It was rich and bittersweet, the kind of dessert meant to be enjoyed slowly. Finally, Michael spoke. "Mom," he said softly. "Yes, I think I understand now." Lauren let out a small breath of frustration. "Oh my God." But Michael continued anyway. "I thought this dinner was about a development project," he said. "And now?" I asked. He looked down at the documents again. "Now I realize it was about something else." Lauren shook her head. "You're overthinking this." Michael didn't respond to her. Instead, he looked directly at me. "You wanted to see how we approached the conversation." "Yes." "And how we treated you." "Yes." Lauren laughed sharply. "This is unbelievable." Michael looked at her calmly. "No," he said. "It isn't." She stared at him. "You're actually agreeing with this?" Michael hesitated. Then he answered honestly. "I'm starting to." Lauren leaned back in her chair, clearly exasperated. "Well, congratulations. This has been the most expensive family therapy session I've ever attended." Charles smiled faintly. Victoria hid a small laugh. Michael ignored the comment. "Mom," he said again. "Yes, I should have called you before tonight." I nodded slightly. "Yes." "I should have talked to you about the land first." "Yes." "And I should have read the contract more carefully before bringing it to you." "Yes." He let out a quiet breath. "I'm sorry." The word hung in the air. Lauren rolled her eyes but said nothing. Charles watched quietly. Victoria looked pleased. I studied Michael for a moment, then I said softly, "I know." Lauren frowned. "That's it." Michael looked at her. "What do you mean? You just apologize and everything's fine?" Michael shook his head. "No." Lauren leaned forward. "Then what?" Michael looked at the documents again. "Then we fix the problem." Lauren stared at him. "What problem? The structure?" Lauren sighed loudly. "We've already been through that." Michael nodded. "Yes." He looked at me. "Mom, if the trust retains ownership of the land, would you still consider letting our firm manage part of the development?" Lauren scoffed. "So now we're begging for management contracts." Charles spoke calmly. "It's called negotiation." Lauren glared at him. Michael ignored the comment. I considered his question. Then I answered honestly, "Yes." Lauren blinked. "What?" Michael leaned forward. "Under what conditions the project must protect the trust's assets?" He nodded. "That's reasonable. And the partnership must treat the family respectfully." Michael nodded again. Lauren threw her hands up. "This is ridiculous." Michael turned to her. "Lauren, what we came here asking for control of land that isn't ours." She stared at him. "And then maybe we approached it the wrong way." Lauren shook her head. "This project would make everyone involved wealthy." Charles spoke quietly. "Wealth isn't the only metric." Lauren groaned. "I can't believe I'm hearing this." Victoria finally spoke. "Lauren." What? Victoria smiled gently. "Sometimes business works better when people listen." Lauren said nothing. Michael turned back to me. "Mom, if the bank approves the partnership tomorrow, we'll rewrite the proposal." Lauren looked stunned. "You're serious?" Michael nodded. "Yes." Lauren leaned back in her chair, clearly irritated. "This entire night has been a waste of time." Charles spoke calmly. "I disagree." Lauren looked at him again. "Of course you do." Charles smiled slightly. "I think we all learned something." Victoria nodded. Michael looked thoughtful. Lauren shook her head. "Well, I certainly learned something." What Charles asked. Lauren gestured toward me. "That Francis Allen is far more complicated than I expected." I smiled faintly. "That's usually the case with people?" Michael stood slowly from his chair. "I should call the bank tomorrow," he said. Lauren stared at him. "You're serious about continuing this?" Michael nodded. "Yes. Even after all this, yes." Lauren sighed. "I don't believe this." Charles stood as well. "I think the evening has been productive." Victoria gathered her purse. Michael looked at me again. "Mom, thank you for coming tonight. You're welcome," Lauren muttered under her breath. "Unbelievable." We walked together toward the restaurant exit. Outside, the Atlanta night air was cool and quiet. The city lights reflected off the glass buildings like stars. Michael stopped beside me on the sidewalk. "Mom," he said softly. "Yes, I think Dad would have liked the way you handled tonight." I smiled faintly. "Your father always believed in reading the fine print." Michael laughed quietly. Lauren was already walking toward the car. Charles and Victoria followed behind her. Michael looked at me one more time. "I'll call you tomorrow. I'll be waiting." He nodded. Then he walked away. I stood there for a moment watching the city traffic move slowly down the street, and I thought about how strange life can be. Because sometimes the most important business negotiations don't happen in boardrooms. They happen over dinner tables, where respect, memory, and responsibility quietly decide the future. Sometimes the most powerful moments in life begin with something small, a laugh, a comment, a moment when someone assumes they understand you without really seeing you. That night at dinner began with a joke about an old dress, but it revealed something much deeper. It showed how easily people judge value based on appearances, clothes, wealth, status, titles. And it reminded me of something my husband used to say all the time: real value is built slowly, quietly, and often by people no one notices. The land everyone wanted that night didn't appear by accident. It existed because two people Robert and I worked for decades, building something one careful step at a time. Every late night in the workshop, every risk we didn't take because we weren't ready. Every decision made to protect the future instead of chasing quick profit. That's the difference between building something and simply acquiring something. And sometimes the people who inherit success forget that difference. But here's the truth I want to leave you with. Respect matters more than opportunity, because opportunities come and go. Money grows and disappears. But respect, real respect, is the foundation that keeps families, businesses, and relationships from collapsing. If someone wants to share in the future you built, they should first understand the story behind it. So I'd love to ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story? Maybe someone judged you too quickly. Maybe they assumed you didn't belong in the room. If that's happened to you, share your experience in the comments. I read them all, and I truly enjoy hearing where everyone is watching from. Also tell me your city. And the time where you are right now, I'm always amazed by how far these stories travel around the world. And if you enjoy stories about family resilience and the quiet strength people often overlook, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the most important lessons come from the moments when someone laughs and you calmly open your purse.